So again, we are about to go in and look at this Flexbox tutorial from W3 Schools. Look at the cheat sheet if as you have time. Same with the complete guide to Flexbox. But what I'd like all of you to do, please, is to right now go out to WestBows.com. WestBows.com. That's a guy's name. His name is WestBows. All right. If you go out there, it looks like this. Now, I'm going to tell you the good things about WestBows, and I'm going to tell you the bad things about WestBows. The good thing about WestBows is if you go over, he's got a lot of courses here, and many of them are free. All right. I'm going to give you a little time today. I would like you to go over. You got to go down a little bit and find it, and sign up for his What the Flexbox course. Now, if you do it today, it'll probably take you 2 hours. And if you say, I don't have time for that, I'd still like you to do it if and as you get time. Tomorrow, I'm going to mention the other course of his, and that is CSS Grid. Now, you do have to sign up. I've been signed up with him for probably about 2 years. I've gotten 2 emails just to tell me that he's added more courses. That's it. I mean, no sales pitch, no nothing. That's the good news. The bad news is, for whatever reason, he starts most of his courses by whistling. And he's a really bad whistler. You know, he's and you get that for about 10 or 15 seconds. All right? And every lesson in here. So these lessons that he has in here, just to show you, so here's what the Flexbox, and I've already filled it out, so let's see. Not Flexbox. Well, let's see. So this is basically, these are the lessons, and some of them are as small as 3 or 4 minutes long. I think the longest one is 10 or 12 minutes. All right, so that's why I said you can go through the whole thing this morning. You don't have to necessarily do that, but you can do that. All right, why do I want you to do this and the other one? Because they're free and because they're actually very informative. He gives about a dozen lessons where he goes over the fundamentals, and then he gives about 6 lessons where he gives examples. That's where this really shines, because some of these things with these examples are things you're going to be doing in your Chapter 9 and 10 test. All right, so there are things you probably want to take a look at so that hopefully they make some sense to you. All right, so that's the What the Flexbox, just so you see them quickly. This is the cheat sheet. Why did I pick that one? Because notice it's interactive and they've got examples in here of everything that goes on. All right, there's not 800 things that are involved in Flexbox, so virtually all of them are shown in here. So this is that other one. This is Yaxel or Yaxel.github. It's the one I gave you on the cheat sheet. And we'll look at the one tomorrow for CSS Grid. All right. This is that article, A Complete Guide to Flexbox. Not a small article, but they've got pictures, they've got befores and afters types of things in here. And again, I've read it before. I think it's good. All right. All right, so let's jump into this. This is the W3 Schools Flexbox tutorial. So if you want to follow through yourselves, in other words, if you want to not look at me doing it, but you want to see it on your own screen, whoop, not there. Then go out to here. If you want to, great. If you don't, totally fine. All right, but I'm going to walk through it because, again, I think it does a good job of going over some of the fundamental concepts of what Flexbox is about. All right, and think of the name. We talked about the box model in an earlier chapter and how basically everything is inside of a box. Now what they're talking about in here with the Flexbox is the ability to take any of those things and put them basically anywhere on a web page you want. Could you do this stuff before Flexbox? The answer is definitely yes. All right, but it was much harder to do. You had to work with floats, and you had to work with relative positioning, etc. You don't have to do nearly as much of that stuff with Flexbox. All right. So as it says, before Flexbox, there was block, there was inline, there was table, and there was positioned. All right. Now, as it says, to start it, you need to first define a flex container. Now, this is not defining a flex container right here. This is HTML. You all know that. Where you define the flex container, this technically it is, because it's going to hold stuff we're going to do flex. But the stuff that you do with flex, you do in CSS. So as it says, this is just a container. So if we ran this right now, that's all that's in there. All right. And when you look, and this is what I want you to see, notice what they've done here is they've said display flex. If you look up on the screen, it's kind of grayish blue or whatever. That's what you end up doing with virtually everything that you want to flex. Now, right here, they're not doing much. Believe me, it'll get better, so to speak, from here. But what can you do here? Well, right now, basically, it's laying it out kind of the way you think it would. In other words, left to right. In other words, there's some default padding in there. There's some default margin in there. You know this as well as I do. We could have come in here and we could have put in, for example, the universal selector, and we could have said margin 0, whoops, 0, and padding 0, and then come over here and close that. And if we did that and we ran it, it looks a little bit different. All right. But I mean, not a whole heck of a lot. That mainly was working on the paragraph that's below it. The point is, what we're going to start seeing in the next part of this is how you use it. But anything that you want to be able to manipulate with Flexbox, you need a display flex. That's kind of beginning, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. All right. So, as it says, the flex container becomes flexible by setting the display property to flex. Now, before we go through these, and we are, let's just quickly take a look. Notice the first one is flex direction. All right. And as it says, it defines which direction the container wants to stack items. Now, notice, okay, there's a columnar, and we'll see a columnar reverse, and then we'll see a row. What's the difference? Columnar is in columns. Row, the 1, 2, 3 will be like it was in the first one. All right. And then we'll come in here and we'll do a reverse, and instead of being 1, 2, 3, it'll be 3, 2, 1. Now, one of the kind of neat things about Flexbox is you can lay out anything you want. So, you know how you lay stuff out in an HTML file, etc. But you can take and totally change that order in Flexbox. You can renumber things without having to actually physically move them around. They will be physically moved around for you based upon what you put in there in your CSS. All right, so like I said, it's not going to pay to go through all of these, but notice in here, we've got for the flex property. All right, it says flex direction column. You'll notice if I come in and change that from column to row, I just changed the word column there to the word row, you see the difference. All right. And there will be other things that we'll just hit upon in just a second. Like I said, I don't want to go through necessarily every single one of these. All right. So I showed you the row and I showed you the column. All right. The reverse, exactly what you think it would be. It will reverse them. And notice, it's a direction. And you probably already guessed, but hey, Jeff, if there's a column reverse, is there a row reverse? Yeah. And also notice when we reverse them by default, it put them way on the left. Now they're way on the right. You say, well, what about centering? We're going to get to that in just a minute. All right. So there's a lot of different stuff that you can do with this. Now, one of the reasons that this is so popular, one of the reasons that people want to use this to overtake, so to speak, using floats, is this is automatically, or as my friend Doug would say, automatically, it's going to be responsive. So notice that when I do this, now it may or may not look like it depending on how this is set, but you see how that's changing? All right, so the widths are automatically changing. Now, in order for that to happen, all right, it says there's 12 flex items there. We want to demonstrate FlexWrap. The reason that that's important is if you leave FlexWrap off. So I'm going to display Flex, but I'm going to take this line of code, and for right now, well, I got to grab the example. I'm going to remove where it says here, FlexWrap. Well, do I have to do it like this? I don't remember. Since it's in CSS, it should be a CSS comment. Good, it works. All right, so I'm taking the FlexWrap off. See what I did? I commented out the FlexWrap. Now I'm going to run this. Well, you can immediately see what happened there. Okay? Not only that, watch what happens as I shrink this. It's doing the best it possibly can to hold all 12 of those in the same column. All right, that's not what we want. But by going back and adding that, so I'm going to uncomment it, you can definitely see the difference. And imagine, I mean, they're using divs here, which they're just basically making a certain size, whatever it is, 10 by 10 or 100 by 100, whatever. But these could be parts of a document. All right. In other words, this could be, these could be sections in a document, paragraphs in a document, etc. If you don't want it to wrap, that's the default, you can say no wrap. All right. And as you probably guessed, because you've seen this before, there's a wrap reverse. All right, which does just that. All right. There's a FlexFlow property. That's a shorthand. So notice with FlexFlow, we can say both the direction, which is row, and the wrap. If it's easier for you to understand by putting them down individually, that's what you should do. All right. Notice there's a justify content property. Well, these should be pretty obvious. All right. Here's a justify center. So it's a quick way to center things. Why does that matter? Well, let's pretend for a second it's your next test. And you are asked on your next test, all right, you may or may not be, but to create a nav bar. And if it has to be centered, you may be told on your next test, because I haven't looked at it yet, sometimes what Mr. Smith will do is he'll say, you cannot use anything up till this point. So in other words, if the next test is on 5 through 8, and if he has that on there, you can't use Flexbox. Does that make sense? All right, because he wants you to do it both ways, because there still is plenty of code out there that's done like this. So this would center. You'll notice that if we do a flex start, all right, it pushes it way towards the left. As you'd probably guess, if there's a flex start, it's probably right down below it. There's a flex end, etc. All right. All right. Then there's a space between and a space around. What's the difference? Let's look. All right. When you use space around, the distance between every one of these is exactly the same. But it does not account for the spacing at the beginning. It does not account for the spacing at the end. If you want to account for the spacing at the beginning and the spacing at the end, then instead of saying space around, you say space between. All right, now it says here, that basically pushes everything over. All right. All right. As it says, there's, we've kind of gone over all this. Flex start, flex end, that's pretty much everything. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at is the fact that when it's working with this stuff, it has two axes. And it's not really the X and the Y axes. They call them something else. You're going to see that in just a couple minutes if you haven't looked at this yet. All right. Notice, too, there's a stretch. And it says that's the default, which basically says, hey, take up as much room as you can. So you'll notice as I'm making this bigger, can't make it too big, but as I'm making it bigger, it'll hold up to 11. As I make it smaller, it'll single stack. And again, it does that by default, which is one of the reasons people like it so much. All right, perfect centering. Okay, you'll notice in here what they've done with this is perfectly centered. And you'll notice again, as I come in and change the size, whoops, I don't know what happened there. But as I come in and change the size, it will stay perfectly centered. It may not look like it, but there you go. It'll move itself over. That is pretty hard to do with just CSS. Yeah, you can use your margin, auto, etc. Doesn't always work exactly the way you think it would, and it doesn't always necessarily going to work and look perfect on every device at every size. This is designed to do so. All right, so at the bottom here, and I'm not going to read one of these to you, but at the bottom they give you the major Flexbox properties. These are things you are going to have to become familiar with. Sooner or later, you will be tested on this. This is a great go-to place because it's right at the end here. All right. And if you click, I'm not going to, but if you click on any one of them, it'll go back to where they explain that stuff up above. All right. Child items. So it says the properties for child items are shown right here. The flex item properties. Order, so you can change the order if you want to. Notice how they've changed the order. It's not reversed order, which you could do, but it's any order you want to change them in. All right. There is a flex grow and a flex shrink property. What that typically does is it works with the amount of space you have. And what you'll see with grow and shrink is typically you will give numbers. The bigger the number, the bigger the space it'll take up. The smaller the number, the smaller the space it'll take up. All right. And there's another thing that you can use with flex basis, which kind of will work with percentages. Then this flex that you see right here, this flex allows you to combine basically all of the other ones together. So let's take a quick look. So again, you can see the ordering property right here. Even though it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, even though that's how it physically was put in. So you'll notice if I'm going to change it myself. So I'm going to put in here 4, then 1, then 2, then 3. And if I run it, all right, you say, wait a minute, order 4. Yeah. That's 4 because it's the number 1. It's at the end. And then number 2 should have been first. Number 3 should have been second. Number 4 should have been third. All right. Now, I've had students when I've gone through this before who said, wouldn't it just be easier to move them? Just physically move them and not worry about it? All right. Yeah, but you've got control here. Maybe it would be. Maybe it wouldn't be. All right. But sometimes what's going to happen is you're setting up a site and you're like, I forgot to add this. And you throw it in there, but you want it to be in a certain place. All right. And you don't want to do a lot of moving and maneuvering around. So Flexbox can come in handy for stuff like that. All right. Again, with the grow property, look at this. Flex grow 1, Flex grow 1, Flex grow 8. So what this is saying is this should take up 80% of whatever room you have for these things. That should take up 10, and that should take up 10. Does that make sense to everybody? And again, as you'd guess, so if I go in here and I'm going to change this to 3 and 2 and 5. And you can see how it changes accordingly. And again, as you come through here and you change the size, notice what it does. It does the best it can for as long as it can. It reaches a certain point, there's not enough room to do much of anything. But as soon as you give it room, there it is. So 50%, 30%, 20%. Shrink works the same way, except instead of growing, it shrinks. Flex bases, as it says, specifies the initial length of a flex item. So it says set the initial length of the third flex item to be 200 pixels. What does that mean? That's this item. So notice how it's not changing. All right. Now, it's just, again, with some of these, I've had people say to me, I looked at that, I don't know why I'd ever use that. And maybe you wouldn't, but it's something that is made available to you, all right, if you want to or need to use it. Again, the flex property is a shorthand. It allows you to combine flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. All right. And then finally, there is an align self property, which is kind of neat. When you look at that, it says it specifies the alignment. So if you've got things of different sizes, all right, you can try to specify the alignment. It says in these examples, we use a 200 pixel high container to better demonstrate the align self property. So this says align the third one here in the middle of the other two. All right. So again, at the end here, these are the items properties. All right. And then finally, all right, CSS Flex Responsive says you learn from media queries that you can use media queries to create different layouts across screen sizes. All right. And they say, for example, if you want to create a 2-column layout on most screen sizes, here's a way that you can do this. All right. What's a little weird to most people, all right, is notice when we make it wider, it's columnar. When we make it narrower, it goes down to more of a row look. All right. And again, I don't want to run through all these examples. All right. I mean, they've got, this is kind of neat. They've got a responsive image gallery with Flexbox. Then they've got an entire responsive website with Flexbox. This is one you may want to take a look at. All right. I don't remember, but I thought that on one or maybe both of when you're working on the Halloween thing and or the shape up, they ask you to do something like this. All right. They give you the code right here for it. I mean, you've got to go and do the try it yourself, but when you do, it's right there. All right. So that's it. Hopefully you found that at least worth going over. So let's jump into the chapter. All right. It's 8:40. I'm going to go till about 9 o'clock. We'll take a break. If we don't finish, which we probably won't, then we'll finish after the break. All right. But I would imagine by somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, we'll be done for today. All right. So they mentioned that in Chapter 5, you'll learn the skills for laying out web pages using the box model. In Chapter 6, we did some floating, etc. All right. And 7 and 8, basically 7 was on, remember, using hyperlinks and list, ordered lists and unordered lists. That didn't have much to do with this. Chapter 8 was on responsive web design. And what you've learned so far with responsive web design, virtually all that you've learned on it has been, well, if I want them to be responsive, remember there were 3 things. You want a fluid design with a fluid layout, not a fixed layout. You want your images to size accordingly. And you want to use media queries on an as-needed basis. All right. Well, another thing that you can put into your arsenal is Flexbox. And hopefully I'll remember to say this tomorrow also. But some people think, okay, I'm using Flexbox here, so I can't use Grid, or I'm using Grid here, so I can't use Flexbox. If you look at your document, if you look at your document as basically being broken up into, say, a header section, and let's say inside of your main section, let's just say inside of main, you've got two sections and an aside. You with me? So I've got a header, a section, and a side, and a footer. Each one of those can be either Flexbox or Grid. So you can combine the two types together on the same document. And quite often that's what's done. All right. So it says in this chapter, you'll learn how to lay out your pages using Flexbox. This feature makes it easier to lay out content in either column or rows, and it makes it easier to implement RWD or responsive website design. Now, you've already had a lot of this stuff that's in the chapter, all right? So I want to take a look at what's in here. Now, this is a confusing diagram, all right? But when you look at it, what they're saying by default is that the main axis goes horizontally, all right? And the cross axis goes vertically. Now, that said, that's the default. But remember, you can change things around. If you change things around, what says main axis right now becomes the cross axis, and what says cross axis right now becomes the main axis, depending on how you lay things out on a page. All right. Now it says here current support for Flexbox, and again, other than pre-IE 11, so IE 10 and below, it's supported by everything that's in here. And it says here not available. I don't know if that's right or not. So again, I can come out to the old caniuse.com and I can type in here Flexbox. Hit enter, and there's the support. You'll notice that all of it, other than early IE and a few others, early Opera Mobile, has at least limited support. And most of the time, it's got full support if you're using a newer version of a browser. I watched this, I was watching a video last night by this guy that I follow him online. His name's Brad Traversy, and he's got a lot of really good stuff. And he was saying, well, this is going to work down everything except Internet Explorer. And right away he goes, and who gives a damn about them? That's what he said, and he's like, I shouldn't talk like that. He said, I know a lot of people still they use an older version or they're supporting sites that have an older version, he said, but I don't really get it. All right. All right. I was telling the class yesterday in the afternoon, because right now for the first 2 weeks of class, we're reviewing this book. All right. And so basically between today and tomorrow we'll finish, and when they come back from the break, they're going to get a test. It's going to be an overall JavaScript test. All right. But what I tell them, and I'm just going to try to echo it to you right now, I may have said this already, I don't know. But if you're not going to take the time to read these chapters, at least page through them and look at the descriptions on the right-hand side on the bottom of the page, because that's where they're summarizing what they mentioned on the left-hand page. Okay, I don't want to read to you. Okay, but they do talk about flex direction. They talk about the main axis. They talk about the cross axis. All right. So how to create your first Flexbox. One thing they have at the end of the chapter here, and again, it's at the end of the chapter, is they go back to one of the things that they created before. I think it's this San Joaquin thing, and they make it flexible using Flexbox. So again, if we go through this and we get all the way through and you're like, I'm still kind of confused, then go back and take a look at that. Hopefully that'll give you some help. All right. So we've already talked about this. Display flex. All right. flex direction column. Now, it says here, the layout of the navigation menu is going to look like this. Sometimes when you do stuff with Flex, if it's the default, it's not going to look any different. So if it's laid out that way to begin with, it won't look different. Sometimes it'll be almost 180-degree difference, night and day type of thing. All right, but quite often it's going to be a subtle difference. Oh, that stuff lines up a lot nicer than it did before. Oh, yeah, I wanted that. I have a 2-column format, but I wanted my first column to take up about 70% and my second column to take up about 30%. You could have done that with just CSS, but it's kind of a pain. And it doesn't always look exactly the same as you shrink it down or as you look at it on other mediums. Plus, again, one of the great things about this, as you saw, is when it gets small enough, when it shrinks down small enough, you'll notice that almost always it goes to a 1-column stack format, which is perfect for phones. All right. All right. Now, they do mention here that every element has a display property depending on whether or not it's a block element or an inline element. All right. It says to display any of these elements as a flex container, you set the display property to flex. That's the start. If you put the other stuff in, but you don't set something to flex, nothing's going to happen, to my knowledge. I've never tried doing that, but I don't know why it would. All right. So here's the major properties up on page 329. If you remember, we already looked at these. And when you look at the top here, it says the property for aligning flex items along the main axis. And we played with justified content. All right. And we looked at these. So you can see maybe I should have done this because maybe this is a better picture. But I thought by going in and running those and changing a few of them, it'd make it easier in real time for you to see the differences. So this is the bottom of page 329. So you'll notice space between, all right, space around. Here's one we didn't even look at. Space evenly. That says everything is even the area at the beginning and the area at the end. All right. And I don't know about you. You haven't done that much work with this so far. But to me, pardon my French, it's always been a pain in the ass when you got to, oh, now I got to move that over 5 pixels so it looks right. And that drives people nuts. It does. And there's a lot less of that you typically have to do when you use this. All right. And one thing, because I'll probably forget to mention tomorrow, I may have already said it to you, but one of the biggest differences, and there's several, but one of the biggest differences between using Flexbox and Grid is you've got main axis, cross axis, but it's 2-dimensional, XY type of thing. When you bring in Grid, there's a 3rd dimension. All right. They call it the Z axis basically, and it's where you want to place something. You'll see that tomorrow. All right. So again, there's examples. I'm not going to say any more about them. All right. Hopefully, looking at those and taking a look, it makes enough sense to you so that if you had to use those, you'd be able to. And that's good because you have to use those. All right. All right. So how to flex items along the cross axis is next here. So again, we've got align items and we've got align self. Notice align items, as it says within the flex container along the cross axis, align self overrides the cross axis for an individual item. All right. If you remember, that was that example that we looked at where one thing was sized differently. And here are the different things. And again, there are some pictures, they don't show all of them. Notice that up there under the common values, stretch is the default. It doesn't hurt to put in there, all right, a line item stretch, but it's not doing anything because it's the default. Some people do anyway, though. Center is just that. You want to center them inside of the container. Start pushes them off to the left. End pushes them off to the right. All right. Baseline, as it says, the content within each one is aligned at the bottom. So baseline right here, okay, would be all the where it says home, speakers, etc. That would all be written down at the very bottom here. All right. And auto, as it says, you only use that when you are doing the align self. That's probably the hardest one, and that's the one, if you're going to work with one, you probably want to work with, just to play around with it. As it says here, the align items property determines how flex items are aligned across the cross axis. All right. All right. So wrap, we already looked at wrap. You learned what wrap was. I showed you, if you remember, we had that thing that was 12 columns wide. And without wrap, the system just attempts to keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the width of each column until, if there is no more room, you just don't see the ones that anymore. But with wrap, so the default is no wrap. But with wrap, when you get to a certain point, okay, it'll wrap them around. How? It depends on the width that you're working with. All right, again, once it gets small enough, it will automatically stack. All right, so as it says, the flex wrap we went over again. The align content determines how these are aligned within the container. Stretch, which is, again, is the default. Center, start to the left, end to the right, space between, space around, etc. We've looked at these now. All right. Now notice, by default, items are not wrapped within a container. All right. This causes, if it's set to a specific width, to wrap within the item or to get cut off. That's what you saw. All right. By default, wrap flex items extend from the top to the bottom of the flex container. And again, you can change that if you want to. All right. A little bit more. We looked before at that flex basis, and as it says, it indicates the initial length of the flex item. If you remember, that's when we had the 4 things, and the one that was in the number 3, I think, was 200 pixels. That said, don't change it. All right. Grow, as it says, indicates basically the percentage. And when we put the grow in there, again, if you remember, I took the example, like let's just say we had a grow. I think the ones they had in there were a 1 and a 1 and an 8. And there were 3 containers. So the first one took up 10%, the second one took up 10%, the third one took up 80%. All right. Shrink, again, is pretty much how much the item will shrink in reference to the other ones. Notice, here the default is 0, which means they don't grow. Here the default is 1, which means they don't shrink. The way you learn this is not by listening to me. It's by sitting there and just playing with it. All right. Flex, again, is a shorthand for all of them. So again, they start to go through some examples in here. All right. So notice CSS that uses flex basis and flex shrink. So they've got a layout of a certain width. And again, you will notice when you start to do that, as you shrink it down, how it changes. I don't want to sit and read to you, but it's more on grow and shrink here, okay? All right. Order we have talked about already. And remember, with the order, it's the default order by default, the order in which you put things on the page. But you can use the order. So notice here, what they said was they wanted the section to be first, and they wanted the sidebar to be second. And you can say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, remember, let's just assume, let's pretend for a second, and probably that's the way it was. So let's say that when we listed this, we had header, then we had sidebar, then we had section, then we had footer. You all with me? So if we have no flex in there, that's how it'll be. When we put in flex, this is how it is. But right now, if we look at this, this is in a columnar format. If we put it in row, now what's going to happen is sections over here and sidebars over here. All right. So as it says here, by default, all the items within a Flex container are displayed in the order in which they appear in the HTML. You use the order property to change that. As it says, it's particularly useful when you're developing a responsive design. I don't know about you, but I'd rather learn this stuff and play with it like this than I would be always writing media queries for every single thing. All right. All right. So I guess we will finish. I might go over by a couple minutes. So the last thing that's in this chapter, as it says, is a responsive web page that uses Flexbox. All right, they show you the design. All right, this is bad. Hopefully everybody agrees. This is bad right there. All right, even if, in fact, maybe it's not, because they've got the menu here, so that's going to hide the menu. I guess I'd have to see the bottom. All right, but the point is this. You've got all these book applications. So if you really want to learn this stuff, bring up this application and start changing stuff. But don't change 100 things at once. Change one thing. Once you've got a little idea of what's happening, change it back and then change something else. All right. So as it says, for desktop layout, flexible box layout is used for the navigation bar. All right. For mobile layouts, it says Flexbox layout is used for the header. Well, what are they talking about? Well, you see, when the navigation bar gets too small, all right, it becomes what's called a hamburger menu. They may have very well used that slick nav thing in there that you may or may not have read about yet, but you will. All right. Now, when in a few weeks, when we go over and we look at something like Bootstrap, you have to put a little code in, but you code that in there yourself. But this is what people expect, especially on a phone. Even what we could do right there is you could stack them. Not even have this, but just stack them. So we would have here, we would have home, then underneath that we would have speakers, and underneath that we would have get tickets, and underneath that become a member, and underneath that about us. That's pretty much what happens when you click this. But people expect it to look like this. All right. That's just the way, basically, it's what the most people do it. Plus, you'll notice that once we get small enough, now rather than having a float here, which may or may not be the way they did it, did they have to use a float? No. Couldn't they have set this up right here into a 2-column format where this was taking up 10 and this was taking up 90%? And then they could have told both of these basically to shift to the left. All right, so there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. Then when you reach, bless you, when you reach a certain width, notice what happens. All right. So they do come in here, they give you the HTML. By now, all right, it's bigger than most of the HTML that we've looked at. But if you take a good look at that HTML that's in there, there really and truly should not be anything that's in there that's foreign to you. Now, you might look at it and say, yeah, but look at this article thing here. That is, it's an article tag. I've told you before, what some people do is they write sections. And their sections contain articles. Just like in the old-fashioned newspaper, all right, you'd have a sports section which would contain articles on sports. You'd have an entertainment section which has articles on entertainment. In fact, I'm not going to do it, but if I go out to CNN.com, it's like that now. People just get used to seeing stuff like that. But as far as the tags that are in here, there shouldn't be anything that we haven't already gone through, is what I'm telling you. All right. So they says the UL element for the menu bar is implemented as a flex box that contains LI elements as flex items. So the container is the UL. The items are the LIs. Does that make sense? All right. The main element will be implemented as a flex box that contains article and aside elements. So again, main, all right, main basically is the big cheese, so to speak. It's the container, and the items are article and aside. It says in the media query for mobile devices, the aside and article elements will be displayed in a column and the aside will be displayed. So in other words, what they're saying is it's not that media queries go away, but now you can also add Flexbox to your media queries. All right. All right, then they give you the CSS. Again, what's new in here? Well, the good news is what's new in here, they show you in yellow. And in your, of course, in our book, it's like a grayish, but you get the idea. So again, everything that's got to change in here, they show it. And one thing to realize about this, you probably already do, they're showing you a way of doing it. I'm not saying they're showing you the way of doing it, because there is no definitive way that somebody, this is the best way of doing it. No, that's the best way in their opinion of doing it. All right. So it says all float and clear properties related to the article and asides have been deleted. We don't need floats because and since we don't need floats, we don't need to worry about clearing floats. Now, if you ever have a site and you're, that you're working on and you're converting everything over, all right, I wouldn't remove that float. I would comment it out and the clear and make sure it still works. All right. And a lot of times, another reason why oftentimes people will use a thing like Git, because you could go in and make those changes, all right, then do your commit and say, I've removed the floats and clears and replace them with Flexbox. You could always revert back to an older version then if you needed to. All right. As it says, to the with property for the article and the aside as well have been deleted. Then there's a separate CSS for mobile. Now you've got your choice because these are media queries. We talked about this before. Either you can create them all in the first regular CSS file, and again, by default, which means unless told otherwise, media queries go at the bottom. But sometimes you put them in a separate file. Now, the only reason I'm showing you that is when we look in here, they start at the body, so I guess they don't have, nope, they don't have it. I thought maybe they would show it, but remember, since we have two different files, we sure as heck better have two different link tags. Now, the order should not matter in those link tags. All right. But again, you'll see it in the example, or the thing that's in the book. All right. As it says, in the mobile layup, the Flexbox is used for the header and the items that are centered in a column. In the mobile layout, the article and the aside are in a column and the order is reversed. So if it normally went article aside, it'll now go aside or article. That's the kind of thing, too, that if you were doing that for somebody, you would have to basically say to them, hey, how do you want this on a phone? All right. But again, if you build that and bake that in first, where first you start caring about mobile, going up makes it much easier than it does starting big and going down. All right, so that's it. You know what your homework, etc. is here. So tomorrow morning when you come in, it's about the same size chapter, maybe a little longer, but we're going to talk about grid layout. All right. Questions on anything we went over today? All right, so you now have what? Over 2 hours, 2 hours and 50 minutes to work on homework, written tests, whatever. All right. Pick it up tomorrow then.